Hello friends. The first video that we did, we discussed risk. We tried to define it and then we look at the different kinds of risks that people and organizations face. And today we're going to look at, which is pretty much like continuation from our last lecture, risk control. Today it's like, what do we do with the risk after we defined it? So we call it risk control. So risk control is defined as a conscious act or decision not to act that reduces the frequency or severity of losses or make losses more predictable. What does it mean? So risk control is when you make a decision to do something about the risk that you define and you find in your organization or in your life. So you do risk control. It's the decision you make that follows after that. That kind of makes losses, if they were, more predictable. So there are a lot of ways how you can deal with risk. Like remember, we talked about the risks that your house might burn. You can either just do nothing about it or you want to do something about it. So that's the reason why every time we are looking at to say, you buy a car, why do we buy insurance? So insurance is one of the ways that we do risk. But there are so many ways of doing risk. So sometimes, because there's the first one we're going to look at is avoidance. Avoidance, which is the risk control technique that involves ceasing or never undertaking an activity so that the possibility of future losses occurring from that activity is eliminated. This is when you choose not to do it at all. You avoid the risk itself. Like for instance, you're afraid you might be involved in an accident, so you don't buy a car, you don't drive, you just stay home and don't do anything. But that's not practical. But that's an option you have. You buy a bike, you ride, you walk everywhere you want to go because you don't want to get involved in the risk of driving. Or let's say for instance, business, you're afraid you might lose money, so you don't do business at all. You just go get a job somewhere and work and let the owner of that business bear the risk of losing money. So that's, you avoid it altogether. We call that risk avoidance. The second thing is risk prevention. Risk prevention is a technique that reduces the frequency of a particular loss. So risk prevention is like you do something about it. You know, well, this house might burn. So what do? Maybe you go buy you do like when you're driving, so you don't get involved in an accident, you drive carefully, speed limit. You're not driving carelessly. You're preventing yourself from getting involved in an accident. That's prevention. You do something that makes sure you're more careful not to get involved in an accident. And then another one is risk loss reduction. Loss reduction is you still do the things that you do, but you kind of make sure that if something bad happens, it shouldn't be as bad. Let's say, for instance, fire will come. So risk reduction will be like you buy a fire extinguisher. So when fire comes, you can put it out before it does too much damage. That's risk reduction. You've reduced the thing will happen, but it doesn't have to do too much damage. Another technique, we call it separation. So separation is a technique that depresses a particular asset or activity over several locations and regularly relies on the asset or activity as part of the organization's working resources. Like for instance, sometimes most companies, they do this. They separate their risks. You don't have, let's say you have a factory, you build two factories. So that way they say there's a fire in one factory, the other one will keep up producing stuff. I'm trying to think exactly how people can separate their risks. Like for instance, this is too much so, but it does happen. I've seen people driving, going on vacation, the whole family in one car, and an accident happens. God forbid, everybody perishes. So how do you reduce the risk? You drive two cars, or some people fly, some people drive. That way, the tragedy of losing the whole family at one time, you don't travel together. You solve that problem by separation. And another technique is duplication. So duplication is a risk technique that uses backup spares or copies of critical property information or capabilities that keep them in reserve. Duplication, sometimes it works especially for companies whereby they have backup systems whereby when you printing something, you save it in another location. You keep two copies of the same thing. So let's say something gets destroyed here, you just bring the other one in. Let's say it's very expensive for a human being, but companies do that. You have duplicate copies of something. And another technique we call diversification. This one, it says it spreads the project over numerous project products, markets, or regions. That's when you diversify your portfolio. I mean, when investment, people talk about diversification, it's like don't put your eggs in one basket. I know there was this other time, my wife is in the business of making hot sauce. So you have you have more farmers. Let's say, for instance, she made a mistake one time. She had one farmer. So I was like, this is a mistake of having all your eggs in one farmer. Yeah. So something happens here. So your diversification is whereby you have if you're dealing with a project, you have different products and all that. So it says that's part of how you deal with risk. And the most interesting thing about risk, though, it's like now, because things will happen, losses will happen. It's just the way life is. So now, as a risk professionals, they'll look at what will they do should something happen. Their house will burn. At times, it does. So what happens when it does? This is the beautiful thing about when you think about this thing before they happen. So one of the ways of dealing with risk is we call it risk financing. So what is risk financing? A conscious act or decision not to act that generates the funds to pay for losses and risk control measures or to offset variability in cash flow. So, like you see, insurance is mostly a conscious decision to do something or not to do something. So, how do you deal with risk? Sometimes there's one technique that they use for refinancing the risk now. So, what happens when something happens? What happens when the house burns? What happens if there's an accident, the car crashes? So, the first technique they use is risk retention. It's a risk financing by which losses and variabilities in cash flow are financed by generating funds within the organization. This usually happens for big companies who have big pockets. Like, for instance, if you find companies like Apple, they got $1 billion of money. These companies don't buy insurance because they have enough money. Should something happen, they can pay. So what these guys are doing, they're retaining the losses. So if it happens, well, we're just going to write a check to pay for it. So they've retained the risk. They're still doing everything they're doing, but they're hoping when it happens, we'll pay for it. That's called risk retention. Sometimes there's a technique we use, risk transfer. Technique by which the financial responsibility for losses and variabilities, cash flow, is shifted to another person. So you transfer the risk. Okay, let's look at for one example of transferring risk. Let's say you don't want to take the responsibility that should your house burn down, you don't want to be the one to pay for it. So how do you do it? Sometimes maybe you just don't buy a house. You avoid it by not doing it. But this is, for instance, but you still need the house. So what do? You rent. So you're going to live in the same house like you bought it, but you're renting it from somebody. So what happens is you've transferred the risk of building another house after it burns to somebody else who owns the house in exchange for rent, of course. So that means you've transferred the exposure of paying for the house when it burns to somebody else. But your life hasn't changed. You might pay a little bit more than otherwise would, but you have done that. So the another technique that we use, you find that it's interesting. I'm gonna go like a step further. Insurance. Insurance is a mechanism that transfers the potential financial consequences of a certain specific loss exposure from the insured to the insurer. So insurance is also part of transfer. Remember the transfer, that you transfer this responsibility to the landlord. You've transferred that. I don't deal with it. If when you transfer to the landlord, like for instance, you say you're renting now. If something breaks down in the house, you just call somebody. Hey, the dishwasher is not working, so it's up to him to come and fix it. What if you had owned the house? It's all on you. So you've transferred that responsibility to the landlord. So who's going to come and fix your everything else? So, but insurance, insurance is also part of risk transfer. Except the difference is insurance only transfers the financial consequences of insurance. Is about money. Who pays for what? The financial consequences that comes after a loss. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how insurance, the operation of insurance itself, how insurance is structured, how they make money. So you'll see that we'll deal with the laws of large numbers. We'll deal with insurance to value. That's the techniques, the insurance rating purposes, the premium you pay, why you pay so much, why you pay this. The next video we'll talk about insurance. So, but now I want you just to know, like risk control, we use insurance to transfer the financial consequence. Should something happen to my house, I am paying for it. Who's paying for it? Insurance. So you've transferred the financial consequences of you paying for your house which is burnt to insurance company for a cost though. So it's, and there's another technique which you call alternative risk transfer. Alternative risk transfer is more of this is more professional. As a common person, it's hard to understand, but it's not insurance, but it's also insurance. Maybe like for instance, an examples of an alternative risk transfer is like high deductible plans, whereby you pay a lot of money, or you're paying for. They'll tell you, well, you return most of it, the loss exposure, but insurance company only pay so much after. It's mostly for business companies, insurance professionals. If you're students trying to learn from here, I would encourage you to go back, get a book and read it. It's iffy and very complicated. It happens. For a common man, you think that's insurance, but for everybody else, it's not insurance. But now, since it's insurance ninjas, nerds, yeah, you will deal with it. So that's what we have for today. So, but there's one thing I wanted also to tell you guys about insurance. That insurance is it's not as all. So the difference between insurance and everything else, risk management, because risk managers can be in finance, but that has nothing to do with insurance. You're just trying to control what happens in your life, everyday life. It just makes you more cautious about your surrounding. That's the beautiful thing about insurance. So, if you're watching us from YouTube, I would love for you if you could subscribe. And then, otherwise, like us, put some comments there, like I've always said. We'll answer some of your questions. Thank you for watching. Peace.